shiny peoples. Um, I know that I previously said that it would take us 2 more readings to finish this book. However, it looks like it may take us 3 readings just because the rate at which renovations are taking place in the house and things like that. However, we shall see how far we get today. Also, as evident by the outfit I am wearing, I have someplace to go tonight that requires me to be less than casual. So, if we don't make it very far, there is a chance that I will have a stream because I can stream while I continue to get ready. My voice is a little shaky today. In the meantime, I had to speak a lot yesterday. That is probably why. In the meantime, though, we will try to make some headway to ensure that at least in 3 readings we will get to the next book, if not 2. It's one of the slower books, but it's going to pick back up, if not in Wizards and Glass, but definitely in Wolves of Vacaya. Also, the only other announcement is I've got my first outside voice for book club, working on a project. So I'm really, really happy about it, and I'm really excited about it, and I can't wait to share it with you guys. I asked this person to read this book for us because this started by accident, but and this is a book I would like to have in the collection, but it is definitely a book that should not be read by me. And not in a personal preference, I like her voice, I don't like her voice sort of way, I don't care, right? But because of the author himself. And so I will be announcing that soon, and I'm really, really, really excited. And to the person who agreed to read that book for me, thank you so much. Thank you so, so much. You have no idea how much that means. I really, really appreciate you. And I absolutely cannot wait. Thanks. All right, now that being said, as always, forgive all the interruptions and things like that because I do not record these. And I tend to have a busy house with loud animals. So where were we? After they had run for God knew how long, all Jake knew for sure was that the drums had stopped again, Gasher once more yanked him to a stop. This time, Jake managed to keep his feet. He had gotten his second wind. Gasher, who would never see 11 again, had not. "Whew, my old pump's due a nip-up, sweetie." "Too bad," Jake said unfeelingly, then stumbled backwards as Gasher's gnarled hand connected with the side of his face. "Yar, you'd cry a bit tear if I dropped dead right here, wouldn't yer?" "Too likely. But no such luck, my fine young squint. Old Gasher's seen 'em come and seen 'em go, and I wasn't born to drop dead at the feet of any little sweet-cheeks berry like you." Jake listened to these incoherencies impassively. He meant to see Gasher dead before the day was over. Gasher might take Jake with him, but Jake no longer cared about that. He dabbed blood from his freshly split lip and looked at it thoughtfully, wondering at how quickly the desire to murder could invade and conquer the human heart. Gasher observed Jake looking at his bloody fingers and grinned. "Sap's running, isn't it? Nor will it be the last your old pal Gasher beats out of your young tree, unless you look sharp, unless you look very sharp indeed." He pointed down at the cobbled surface of the narrow alley they were currently negotiating. There were rusty manhole covers there, and Jake realized he had seen the words stamped in the steel not long ago. Lemerck Foundry, they said. There's a grip on the side, Gasher said. You see? Get your hands into that and pull away. Step lively now, and maybe you'll still have all your teeth when you meet up with the tick-tock. Jake grasped the steel cover and pulled. He pulled hard, but not quite as hard as he could have done. The maze of streets and alleys through which Gasher had run him was bad, but at least he could see. He couldn't imagine what it might be like in the underworld below the city, where the blackness would preclude even dreams of escape, and he didn't intend to find out unless he absolutely had to. Gasher quickly made it clear to him that he did. It's too heavy for, Jake began, and then the pirate seized him by the throat and yanked him upward until they were face to face. The long run through the alleys had brought a thin, sweaty flush to his cheeks and turned the sores eating into his flesh an ugly yellow-purple color. Those which were open exuded thick, infected matter and threads of blood in steady pulses. Jake caught just a whiff of Gasher's thick stench before his wind was cut off by the hand which had encircled his throat. Listen, you stupid Cole, and listen well, for this is your last warning. You yank that fucking street head off right now, or I'll reach into your mouth and rip the living tongue right out of it. And feel free to bite all you want while you do it, for what I have runs in the blood, and you'll see the first blossoms on your own face before the week's out. If you lives that long. Now do you see? Jake nodded frantically. Gasher's face was disappearing into deep folds of gray, and his voice seemed to be coming from a great distance. All right. Gasher shoved him backward. Jake fell in a heap beside the manhole cover, gagging and retching. He finally managed to draw in a deep, whooping breath that burned like fire. He spat out a blood-flecked wad of stuff and almost threw up at the sight of it. Now yank back that cover, my heart's delight, and let's have no matter about it. Jake crawled over it, slid his hands into the grip, and this time pulled with all his might. For one terrible moment he thought he still was not going to be able to budge it. Then he imagined Gasher's finger reaching into his mouth and seizing his tongue, and found a little extra. There was a dull, spreading agony in his lower back as something gave there, but the circular lid slipped slowly aside, grinding on the cobbles and exposing a grinning crescent of darkness. Good, Cully, good, Gasher cried cheerfully. What a little mule you are. Keep pulling. Don't give up now. When the crescent had become a half-moon, and the pain in Jake's lower back was white-hot fire, Gasher booted him in the ass, knocking him asprawl. Very good, Gasher said, peering in. Now, Cully, go smartly down the ladder on the side. Mind you don't lose your grip and tumble all the way to the bottom, for those rungs are fearsome slick and greasy. There's 20 or so, as I remember. And when you get to the bottom, stand stock still and wait for me. You might feel like running from your old pal, but do you think that would be a good idea? No, Jake said. I suppose not. Very intelligent, old son. Gasher's lips spread in his hideous smile, once more revealing his few surviving teeth. It's dark down there, and there are 1,000 tunnels going every which way. Your old pal Gasher knows them like the back of his hand, so he does, but you'd be lost in no time. There's the rats, very big and very hungry they are, so you just wait. I will. Gasher regarded him narrowly. You speak just like a little Triggy, don't you? Do, but you're no pube. I'll set my watch and warrant to that. Where are you from, Squint? Jake said nothing. Bumbler got your tongue, do he? Well, that's all right. Tick-Tock will get it out of you, so he will. He's got a way about him, Ticky does. Just naturally wants to make people converse. Once he gets 'em going, they sometimes talk so fast and scream so loud someone has to hit 'em over the head to slow 'em down. Bumblers ain't allowed to hold no one's tongue around the Tick-Tock, man. Not even fine young triggers like you. Now get the fuck down that ladder, hup. He lashed out with his foot. This time Jake managed to tuck in and dodge the blow. He looked into the half-open manhole, saw the ladder, and started down. He was still chest-high to the alley when a tremendous stone-like crash hammered the air. It came from a mile or more away, but Jake knew what it was without having to be told. A cry of pure misery burst from his lips. A grim smile tugged at the corners of Gasher's mouth. Your hard-case friend trailed you a little better than ye thought he would, didn't he? Not better than I thought, though, Coley, for I got a look at his eye. Weary pert and cunning they are. I thought he'd come after his juicy little night nudge right smart, if he was to come at all, and so he did. He spied the tripwires, but the fountain's got him. So that's all right. Go on, sweet cheeks. He aimed a kick at Jake's protruding head. Jake ducked it, but one foot slipped on the ladder bolted to the side of the sewer shaft, and he only saved himself from falling by clutching Gatcher's scrab-rattled ankle. He looked up, pleading, and saw no softening on that dying, infected face. Please, he said, and he heard the word trying to break into a sob. He kept seeing Roland lying crushed beneath the huge fountain. What had Gasher said? If anyone wanted him, they would have to pick him up with a blotter. Beg if you want, dear heart. Just don't expect no good to come of it, for mercy stops on this side of the bridge, so it does. Now go down, or I'll kick your bleeding brains right out your bleeding ears. So Jake went down, and by the time he reached the standing water at the bottom, the urge to cry had passed. He waited, shoulders slumped and head down, for Gasher to descend and lead him to his fate. Roland had come close to tripping the crossed wires which held back the avalanche of junk. But the dangling fountain was absurd, a trap which might have been set by a stupid child. Court had taught them to constantly check all visual currents as they moved in enemy territory, and that included above as well as behind and below. Stop, he told Oy, raising his voice to be heard over the drums. Up, Oy agreed, then looked ahead and immediately added, Ache. Yes. The gunslinger took another look up at the suspended marble fountain, then examined the street looking for the trigger. There were two, he saw. Perhaps their camouflage as cobblestones had once been effective, but that time was long past. Roland bent down, hands on his knees, and spoke into Oy's upturned face. Gonna pick you up for a minute now. Don't fuss, Oy. Oy. Roland put his arms around the bumbler. At first, Oy stiffened and attempted to pull away, and then Roland felt the small animal give in. He wasn't happy about being this close to someone who wasn't Jake, but he certainly intended to put up with it. Roland found himself wondering again just how intelligent Oy was. He carried him up the narrow passage and beneath the hanging fountain of blood, stepping carefully over the mock cobbles. Once they were safely past, he bent to let Oy go. As he did, the drums stopped. Ache, Oy said impatiently. Ache, ache. Yes, but there's a little piece of business to attend to first. He led Oy 15 yards further down the alley, then bent and picked up a chunk of concrete. He tossed it thoughtfully from hand to hand, and as he did, he heard the sound of a pistol shot from the east. The amplified thump of the drums had buried the sound of Eddie and Susanna's battle with the ragged band of pubes, but he heard this gunshot clearly and smiled. It almost surely meant that Dean had reached the cradle, and that was the first good news of this day, which already seemed at least a week long. Roland turned and threw the piece of concrete. His aim was as true as it had been when he had thrown at the ancient traffic signal in River Crossing. The missile struck one of the discolored triggers dead center, and one of the rusty cables snapped with a harsh twang. The marble fountain dropped, rolling over as the other cables snugged it for a moment longer, long enough so that a man with fast reflexes could have cleared the drop zone anyway, Roland reckoned. Then it too let go, and the fountain fell like a pink, misshapen stone. Roland dropped behind a pile of rusty steel beams, and Oy jumped nimbly into his lap as the fountain hit the street with a vast, shattery thump. Chunks of pink marble, some as big as carts, flew through the air. Several small chips stung Roland's face. He brushed others out of Oy's fur. He looked over the makeshift barricade. The fountain had cracked in two like a vast plate. We won't be coming back this way, Roland thought. The passageway, narrow to begin with, was now completely blocked. He wondered if Jake had heard the fall of the fountain and what he had made of it if he had. He didn't waste such speculation on Gasher. Gasher would think he had been crushed to paste, which was exactly what Roland wanted him to think. Would Jake think the same thing? The boy should know better than to believe a gunslinger could be killed by such a simple device, but if Gasher had terrorized him enough, Jake might not be thinking that clearly. Well, it was too late to worry about it now, and if he had to do it over again, he would do exactly the same thing. Dying or not, Gasher had displayed both courage and animal cunning. If he was off his guard now, the trick was worth it. Roland got to his feet. Oi, find Jake. Ake! Oi stretched his head forward on his long neck, sniffed around in a semicircle, picked up Jake's scent, and was off again with Roland running after. 10 minutes later, he came to a stop at a manhole cover in the street, sniffed all the way around it, and then looked up at Roland and barked shrilly. The gunslinger dropped to one knee and observed both the confusion of the tracks and a wide path of scratches on the cobbles. He thought this particular manhole cover had been moved quite often. His eyes narrowed as he saw the wad of bloody phlegm in a crease between two nearby cobbles. The bastard keeps hitting him, he murmured. He pulled the manhole cover back, looked down, then untied the rawhide lacings which held his shirt closed. He picked the bumbler up and tucked him into his shirt. Oi bared his teeth, and for a moment Roland felt his claws splayed against the flesh of his chest and belly like small, sharp knives. Then they withdrew, and Oi only peered out of Roland's shirt with his bright eyes panting like a steam engine. The gunslinger could feel the rapid beat of Oi's heart against his own. He pulled up the rawhide lace from his eyelets in his shirt and found another, longer lace in his purse. I'm going to leash you. I don't like it, and you're going to like it even less, but it's going to be very dark down there. He tied the two lengths of rawhide together and formed one end into a wide loop, which he slipped over Oi's head. He expected Oi to bare his teeth again, perhaps even to nip him, but Oi didn't. He only looked up at Roland with his gold-ringed eyes and barked, Ake, again with his impatient voice. Roland put the loose end of the makeshift leash in his mouth. Then he sat down on the edge of the sewer shaft, if that's what it was. He felt for the top rung of the ladder and found it. He descended slowly and carefully, more aware than ever that he was missing half a hand and that the steel rungs were slimy with oil and some thicker stuff, which was probably like moss. Oi was heavy, warm weight between his shirt and belly, panting steadily and harshly. Gold rings in his eyes gleamed like medallions in the dim light. At last, the gunslinger's groping foot splashed into the water at the bottom of the shaft. He glanced up briefly at the coin of white light far above him. This is where it starts getting hard, he thought. The tunnel was warm and dank and smelt like an ancient channel house. Somewhere nearby, water was dripping hollowly and monotonously. Further off, Roland could hear the rumble of machinery. He lifted a very grateful Oi out of his shirt and set him down in the shallow water running sluggishly along the sewer tunnel. Now it's all up to you, he murmured in the bumbler's ear. To Jake, Oi. To Jake. Ake! The bumbler barked and splashed rapidly off into the darkness, swinging his head from side to side at the end of his long neck like a pendulum. Roland followed with the edge of the rawhide leash wrapped round his diminished right hand. The cradle. It was easily big enough to have acquired a proper noun status in their minds. It stood in the center of a square 5 times larger than the one where they had come upon the blasted statue, and where she got a really good look at it. Susanna realized how old and gray and fundamentally grungy the rest of Lud was. The cradle was so clean it almost hurt her eyes. No vines overgrew its side, no graffiti daubed its blinding white walls and steps and columns. The yellow plains dust, which had coated everything else, was absent here. As they drew closer, Susanna saw why. Streams of water coursed endlessly down the sides of the cradle, issuing from nozzles hidden in the shadows of the copper-sheathed eaves. Interval sprays created by other hidden nozzles washed the steps, turning them into off-and-on waterfalls. Wow, Eddie said. It must make Grand Central look like a Greyhound station in butt-fuck Nebraska. What a poet you are, dear, Susanna said dryly. The steps surrounded the entire building and rose to a great open lobby. There were no obscuring mats of vegetation here, but Eddie and Susanna found they still couldn't get a good look inside. The shadows thrown by the overhanging roof were too deep. The totems of the beam marched all the way around the building 2 by 2. But the corners were reserved for creatures Susanna fervently hoped never to meet outside of the occasional nightmare. Hideous stone dragons with scaly bodies clutching claw-tipped hands and nasty peering eyes. Eddie touched her shoulder and pointed higher. Susanna looked and felt her breath come to a stop in her throat. Standing astride the peak of the roof, far above the totems of the beam and the dragonish gargoyles, as if given dominion over them, was a golden warrior at least 60 feet high. A battered cowboy hat was shoved back to reveal his lined and careworn brow. A bandana hung askew on his upper chest, as if it had just been pulled down after serving long, hearty, dusty as dust muffled. In one upraised fist he held a revolver, in the other what appeared to be an olive branch. Roland of Gilead stood atop the cradle of Lud, dressed in gold. No, she thought, at last remembering to breathe again, it's not him, but in another way it is. That man was a gunslinger, and the resemblance between him, who's probably been dead 1,000 years or more, and Roland is all the truth of Quartet you'll ever need to know. Thunder slammed out of the south. Lightning harried racing clouds across the sky. She wished she had more time to study both the golden statue which stood atop the cradle and the animals which surrounded it. Each of these latter appeared to have words carved upon them, and she had an idea that what was written there might be knowledge worth having. Under these circumstances, however, there was no time to spare. A wide red strip had been painted across the pavement at the point where the Street of the Turtle emptied into the plaza of the cradle. Maud and the fellow Eddie called Jeeves and Butler stopped a prudent distance from the red mark. This far, no farther, Maud told them flatly. You may take us to our deaths, but each man and woman owes one to the gods anyway, and I'll die on this side of the dead line no matter what. I'll not dare blame for outlanders. Nor will I, Jeeves said. He had taken off his dusty bowler and was holding it against his naked chest. On his face was an expression of fearful reverence. Fine, Susanna said. Now scat on out of here, both of you. You'll backshoot us the second we turn from ye, Jeeves said in a trembling voice. I'll take my watch and warrant on it, so I will. Maud shook her head. The blood on her face had dried to a grotesque maroon stippling. There never were a backshooting gunslinger, that much I will say. We only have their word for it, and that's what they are. Maud pointed to the big revolver with the worn sandalwood grip which Susanna held in her hand. Jeeves looked, and after a moment he stretched out his hand to the woman. When Maud took it, Susanna's image of them as dangerous killers collapsed. They looked more like Hansel and Gretel than Bonnie and Clyde. Tired, frightened, confused, and lost so long in the woods that they had grown old there. Her hate and fear of them departed. What replaced it was pity and a deep, aching sadness. Fare you well, both of you, she said softly. Walk as you will, and with no fear of harm from me or my man here. Maud nodded. I believe you mean us no harm, and I forgive you for shooting Winston. But listen to me, and listen to me well. Stay out of the cradle. Whatever reasons you think you have for going in there, they're not good enough. To enter Blaine's cradle is death. We don't have any choice, Eddie said, and thunder banged overhead as if in agreement. Now let me tell you something. I don't know what's underneath Lud and what isn't, but I do know those drums you're so whacked out about are part of a recording, a song that was made in the world my wife and I come from. He looked at their uncomprehending faces and raised his arms in frustration. Jesus, pumpkin pie Christ! Don't you get it? You're killing each other over a piece of music that was never even released as a single. Susanna put her hand on his shoulder and murmured his name. He ignored her for a moment, his eyes flicking from Jeeves to Maud and then back to Jeeves again. You want to see monsters? Take a good look at each other then. And when you get back to whatever fun house it is you call home, take a good look at your friends and relatives. You don't understand, Maud said. Her eyes were dark and somber. But you will. You will. Go on now, Susanna said quietly. Talk between us is no good. The words only drop dead. Just go your way and try to remember the faces of your fathers, for I think you lost sight of those faces long ago. The two of them walked back in the direction from which they had come without another word. They did look back over their shoulders from time to time, however, and They were still holding hands, Hansel and Gretel lost in the deep, dark forest. "Let me out of here," Eddie said heavily. He made the Ruger safe, stuck it back in the waistband of his pants, and then rubbed his red eyes with the heels of his hands. "Just let me out. That's all I ask." "I know what you mean, handsome." She was clearly scared, but her head had that defiant tilt he had come to recognize and love. He put his hands on her shoulders, bent down, and kissed her. He did not let either their surroundings or the oncoming storm keep him from doing a thorough job. When he pulled back at last, she was studying him with wide, dancing eyes. "Wow, what was that about?" "About how I love you," he said, "and I guess that's about all. Is it enough?" Her eyes softened. For a moment, she thought about telling him the secret she might or might not be keeping. But of course, the time and place were wrong. She could no more tell him she might be pregnant now than she could pause to read the words written on the sculpted portal totems. "It's enough, Eddie," she said. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me." His hazel eyes were totally focused on her. "It's hard for me to say stuff like that. Living with Henry made it hard, I guess, but it's true. I think I started loving you because you were everything Roland took me away from. In New York, I mean. But it's a lot more than that now because I don't want to go back anymore. Do you?" She looked at the cradle. She was terrified of what they might find in there, but all the same, she looked back at him. "No, I don't want to go back. I want to spend the rest of my life going forward, as long as you're with me, that is. It's funny, you saying you started loving me because of all the things he took away from you." "Funny how?" "I started loving you because you set me free of Detta Walker." She paused, thought, then shook her head slightly. "No, it goes further than that. I started loving you because you set me free of both those bitches. One was a foul-mouthed, cock-teasing thief, and the other was a self-righteous, pompous prig. Comes down to 6 of one and half a dozen of the other, as far as I'm concerned. I like Susanna Dean better than either one, and you were the one who set me free." This time it was she who did the reaching, pressing her palm into his stubby cheeks and drawing him down, kissing him gently. When he put a light hand over her breast, she sighed and covered it with her own. "I think we better get going," she said, "or we apt to be laying right here in the streets and getting wet from the look." Eddie stared around at the silent towers, the broken windows, and the vine-encrusted walls a final time, and then he nodded. "Yeah, I don't think there's any future in this town anyway." He pushed her forward, and they both stiffened as the wheels of the chair passed over what Maud had called the dead line, fearful that they would trip some ancient protective device and die together, but nothing happened. Eddie pushed her into the plaza, and as they approached the steps leading up to the cradle, a cold, wind-driven rain began to fall. Although neither of them knew it, the first of the great autumn storms of Midworld had arrived. Once they were in the smelly darkness of the sewers, Gasher slowed the killing pace he'd maintained above ground. Jake didn't think it was because of the darkness. Gasher seemed to know every twist and turn of the route he was following, just as advertised. Jake believed it was because his captor was satisfied that Roland had been squashed to jelly by the deadfall trap. Jake himself had begun to wonder. If Roland had spotted the tripwires, a far more subtle trap than the ones which followed, was it really likely that he had missed seeing the fountain? Jake supposed it was possible, but it didn't make much sense. Jake thought it more likely that Roland had tripped the fountain on purpose, to lull Gasher and perhaps slow him down. He didn't believe Roland could follow them through this maze under the streets. The total darkness would defeat even the gunslinger's tracking abilities, but it cheered his heart to think that Roland might not have died in an attempt to keep his promise. They turned right, left, then left again. As Jake's other senses sharpened in an attempt to compensate for his lack of sight, he had a vague perception of other tunnels around him. The muffled sounds of ancient laboring machinery would grow loud for a moment, then fade as the stone foundations of the city drew close around them again. Drafts blew intermittently against his skin, sometimes warm, sometimes chilly. Their splashing footfalls echoed briefly as they passed the intersecting tunnels from which these stenchy breaths blew, and once Jake nearly brained himself on some metal object jutting down from the ceiling. He slapped at it with one hand and felt something that might have been a large valve wheel. After that, he waved his hands as he trotted along in an attempt to read the air ahead of him. Gasher guided him with taps to the shoulder as a wagoner might have guided his oxen. They moved at a good clip, trotting but not running. Gasher got enough of his breath back to first hum and then begin singing in a low, surprisingly tuneful tenor voice. Ribble tibble to ting ting ting, I'll get a job and buy your ring. When I get my mitts or your jiggly tits, ribbit tibbit tibba ring ring ring. That was a strange song. Anyway. I just want her fiddle around with your ting ting ting. The hell? The reason I'm confused right now is because these songs are supposed to remind me of songs, and I don't know what they're reminding me of. But anyway, there were 5 or 6 more verses along the line before Gasher quit. Now you sing something, Squint. I don't know anything, Jake puffed. He hoped he sounded more out of breath than he actually was. He didn't know if it would do him any good or not, but down here in the dark any edge seemed worth trying for. Gasher brought his elbow down in the center of Jake's back, almost hard enough to send him sprawling into the ankle-high water running sluggishly through the tunnel they were traversing. You better know something, less you want me to rip your ever-loving spine right out your back. He paused, then added, There's haunts down here, boy. They live inside the fucking machines, so they do. Singing keeps 'em off. Don't you know that? Now sing! Jake thought hard, not wanting to earn another love tap from Gasher, and came up with a song he'd learned in a summer day camp at the age of 7 or 8. He opened his mouth and began to bawl it out into the darkness, listening to the echoes bounce back amid the sounds of running water, falling water, and ancient, thudding machinery. My girl's a corker, she's a New Yorker. I buy her everything to keep her in style. She's got a pair of hips just like 2 battleships. Oh boy, that's how my money goes. My girl's a dilly, she comes from Philly. I buy her everything to keep her in style. She's got a pair of eyes just like 2 pizza pies. Oh boy, that's how. Gasher reached out, seized Jake's ears as if they were jug handles, and yanked him to a stop. There's a hole right ahead of yer, he said. With a voice like yours, Squint, it'd be doing the world a mercy to let you fall in it, so it would. But TikTok wouldn't approve at all, so I reckon you're safer for a little longer. Gasher's hands left Jake's ears, which burned like fire, and fastened on the back of his shirt. Now lean forward until you feel the ladder on the other side, and mind you don't slip and drag us both down. Jake leaned cautiously forward, hands outstretched, terrified of falling into a pit he couldn't see. As he groped for the ladder, he became aware of warm air, clean and almost fragrant, whooshing past his face and a faint blush of rose-colored light from beneath him. His fingers touched a steel rung and closed over it. The bite wounds on his left hand broke open again, and he felt warm blood running across his palm. Got it? Gasher asked. Yes. Then climb down. What you waiting for, goddamn? Gasher let go of his shirt, and Jake could imagine him drawing his foot back, meaning to hurry him along with a kick in the ass. Jake stepped across the faintly glimmering gap and began to descend the ladder, using his hurt hand as little as possible. This time the rungs were clear of moss and oil and hardly rusted at all. The shaft was very long, and as Jake went down, hurrying to keep Gasher from stepping on his hands with the thick-soled boots, he found himself remembering a movie he'd once seen on TV, Journey to the Center of the Earth. The throb of machinery grew louder, and the rosy glow grew stronger. The machines still didn't sound right, but his ears told him these were in better shape than the ones above, and when he finally reached the bottom he found the floor was dry. The new horizontal shaft was square, about 6 feet high, and sleeved with riveted stainless steel. It stretched away for as long as Jake could see in both directions, straight as string. He knew instinctively, without even thinking about it, that this tunnel, which had been at least 70 feet under Lud, also followed the path of the beam, and somewhere up ahead, Jake was sure of this, although he couldn't have said why, the train they had come looking for lay directly above it. Narrow ventilation grills ran along the sides of the walls just below the shaft ceiling. It was from these that the clean, dry air was flowing. Moss dangled from some of them in blue-gray beards, but most were still clear. Below every other grill was a yellow arrow with a symbol that looked a bit like a lowercase t. The arrows pointed in the direction Jake and Asher were heading. The rose-colored light was coming from glass tubes which ran along the ceiling of the shaft in parallel rows. Some, about 1 in every 3, were dark, and others sputtered fitfully, but at least half of them were still working. Neon tubing, Jake thought, amazed. How about that? Gasher dropped down beside him. He saw Jake's expression of surprise and grinned. Nice, isn't it? Cool in the summer, warm in the winter, and so much food that 500 men could eat in it in 500 years. And do you know the best part, Squint? The very best part of the whole koozie thinkment? Jake shook his head. Farkin pubies don't have the leastest idea that plays even exist. They think there's monsters down here. Catch a puby going within 20 feet of a sewer cap, less'n he has to. He threw his head back and laughed heartily. Jake didn't join in, even though a cold voice in the back of his mind told him it might be politic to do so. He didn't join in because he knew exactly how the pubes felt. There were monsters under the city. Trolls and boggarts and orcs. Hadn't he been captured by just such a one? Gasher shoved him to the left. Garn, almost there now. Hup. They jogged on, their footfalls chasing them in packs of echoes. After 10 or 15 minutes of this, Jake saw a watertight hatchway about 200 yards ahead. As they drew closer, he could see a big valve wheel sticking out of it. The communicator box was mounted on the wall to the right. I'm blown out, Gasher gasped as they reached the door at the end of the tunnel. Doin's like this are too much for an invalid like your old pal, so they are. He thumbed the button on the intercom and bawled. I got him, Tick-Tock. Got him as dandy as you please. Didn't even muss his hair. Didn't I tell yer I would? Trust the Gasher man, I said, for he'll lead yer straight and true. Now open up and let us in. He let go of the button and looked impatiently at the door. The valve wheel didn't turn. Instead, a flat, drawling voice came out of the intercom speaker. What's the password? Gasher frowned horribly, scratched his chin with his long, dirty nails, then lifted his eye patch and swabbed at another clot of yellow-green goo. Tick-Tock and his passwords, he said to Jake. He sounded worried as well as irritated. He's a trig cove, but there's taken it a deal too far, if you ask me, so it is. He pushed the button and yelled, Come on, Tick-Tock. If you don't recognize the sound of my voice, you need a hearing aid. Oh, I recognize it, the drawling voice returned. To Jake, it sounded like Jerry Reed, who played Burt Reynolds' sidekick in Smokey and the Bandit. But I don't know who's with you, do I? Or have you forgotten that the cameras out there went tits up last year? You give the password, Gasher, or you can rot out there. Gasher stuck a finger up his nose, extracted a chunk of snot the color of mint jelly, and squashed it into the grill of the speaker. Ugh. I'm going to gag right there. Sorry, my imagination is working against me in this chapter. Okay. Jake watched this childish display of ill temper in silent fascination, feeling unwelcome, hysterical laughter bubbling around inside him. Had they come all this way through the booby-trapped mazes and lightless tunnels to be balked here at the water-right door simply because Gasher couldn't remember the Tick-Tock man's password? Gasher looked at him balefully, then slid his hand across his skull, peeling off his sweat-soaked yellow scarf. The skull beneath was bald except for a few straggling tufts of black hair like porcupine quills, and into the scarf and plucked forth a scrap of paper. God's bless Hoots, he muttered. Hoots takes care of me, a right proper he does. He peered at the scrap, turning it this way and that, and then he held it out to Jake. He kept his voice pitched low as if the Tick-Tock man could hear him, even though the talk button on the intercom wasn't depressed. You're a proper little gentleman, ain't you? And the very first thing they teach a gentleman to do after he's been learnt not to eat the paste and piss in the corners is read. So read me the word on this paper, cully, for it's gone right out of my head, so it has. Jake took the paper, looked at it, and then looked up at Gasher again. What if I won't? he said coolly. Gasher was momentarily taken aback at this response, and then he began to grin with dangerous good humor. Why, I'll grab you by the throat and use your head for a door knocker, he said. I doubt if it'll convince old Chicky to let me in, for he's still nervous of your hard case friend, so he is, but it'll do my heart a world of good to see your brains dripping off that wheel. Jake considered this, the dark laughter still bubbling away inside him. The TikTok man was a trig enough cove, all right. He had known that it would be difficult to persuade Gasher, who was dying anyway, to speak the password even if Roland had taken him prisoner. What TikTok hadn't taken into account was Gasher's defective memory. Don't laugh. If you do, he really will beat your brains out. In spite of his brave words, Gasher was watching Jake with real anxiety, and Jake realized a potentially powerful fact. Gasher might not be afraid of dying, but he was afraid of being humiliated. All right, Gasher, he said calmly. The word on this piece of paper is bountiful. Give me that. Gasher snatched the paper back, returned it to his scarf, and quickly wrapped the yellow cloth around his head again. He thumbed the intercom button. Tick-tock, you're still there. Where else should I be? The west end of the world. The drawling voice now sounded mildly amused. Gasher stuck his whitish tongue out at the speaker, but his voice was ingratiating, almost servile. The password's bountiful, and a fine word it is, too. Now let me in, God's cuss it. Of course, the TikTok man said. A machine started up somewhere nearby, making Jake jump. The valve wheel in the center of the door spun. When it stopped, Gasher seized it, yanked it outward, grabbed Jake's arm, and propelled him over the raised lid of the door and into the strangest room he had ever seen in his life. Roland descended into the dusty pink light. Oi's bright eyes peered from the open V of his shirt. His neck stretched to the limit of its considerable length as he sniffed at the warm air that blew through the ventilator grills. Roland had had to depend completely on the bumbler's nose in the dark passages above, and he had been terribly afraid the animal would lose Jake's scent in the running water. Though he had heard the sound of singing, first Gasher, then Jake, echoing back through the pipes, he had relaxed a little. Oi had not led them wrong. Oi had heard it too. Up until then, he had been moving slowly and cautiously, even backtracking every now and again to be sure of himself. But when he heard Jake's voice, he began to run, straining the rawhide leash. Roland was afraid he might call after Jake in his harsh voice, "Ake, Ake!" But he hadn't done so. And just as they reached the shaft which led to the lower levels of the Dycean maze, Roland had heard the sound of some new machine, a pump of some sort, perhaps, followed by the metallic echoing crash of a door being slammed shut. He reached the foot of the square tunnel and glanced briefly at the double line of lighted tubes which led off in either direction. They were lit with swamp fire, he saw, like the sign outside the place which had belonged to Balazar in the city of New York. He looked more closely at the narrow chrome ventilation strips running along the top of each wall, and the arrows below them, then slipped the rawhide loop off Oi's neck. Oi shook his head impatiently, clearly glad to be rid of it. We're close, he murmured into the bumbler's cocked ear, and so we have to be quiet. Do you understand, Oi? Very quiet. Oi replied in a hoarse whisper that would have been funny under other circumstances. Roland put him down, and Oi was immediately off down the tunnel, neck out, muzzle to the steel floor. Roland could hear him muttering, "Ake, Ake, Ake, Ake," under his breath. Roland unholstered his gun and followed him. Eddie and Susanna looked up at the vastness of Blaine's cradle as the skies opened and rains began to fall in torrents. It's a hell of a building, but they forgot the handicap ramps, Eddie yelled, raising his voice to be heard over the rain and thunder. Never mind that, Susanna said impatiently, slipping out of the wheelchair. Let's get up there and out of the rain. Eddie looked dubiously up the incline of the steps. The risers were shallow, but there were a lot of them. You sure, Suze? Race, you white boy, she said, and began to wriggle upward with uncanny ease, using hands and muscular forearms and the stumps of her legs. And she almost did beat him. Eddie had the ironmongery to contend with, and it still slowed him down. Both of them were panting when they reached the top, and the tendrils of the stream were rising from their wet clothes. Eddie grabbed her under the arms, swung her up, and then just held her with his hands locked together in the small of his back instead of dropping her back into the chair, as he had meant to do. He felt randy and half crazed, without the slightest idea why. Oh, give me a break, he thought. You've gotten this far alive, and that's got your glands pumped up and ready to party. Susanna licked her full lower lip and wound her strong fingers into his hair. She pulled. It hurt, and at the same time it felt wonderful. Told you I'd beat you, white boy, she said in a low, husky voice. Get out of here. I had you, by half a step. He tried to sound less out of breath than he was, and found it was impossible. Maybe, but it blew you out, didn't it? One hand left his hair, slid downward, and squeezed gently. A smile gleamed in her eyes. Thunder rumbled across the sky, and they flinched and then laughed together. Come on, he said. This is nuts. The time's all wrong. She didn't contradict him, but she squeezed him again before returning her hand to his shoulder. And he felt a pang of regret as he swung her back into her chair and ran her across vast flagstones and under cover of the roof. He thought he saw the same regret in Susanna's eyes. When they were out of the downpour, Eddie paused and they looked back. The plaza of the Cradle, the street of the Turtle, and all the city beyond was rapidly disappearing into shifting gray curtains. Eddie wasn't a bit sorry. Lud hadn't earned itself a place in his mental scrapbook of fond memories. Look, Susanna murmured. She pointed at a nearby downspout. It ended in a large, scaly fish head that looked like a close relation to the dragon gargoyles which decorated the corners of the cradle. Water ran from its mouth in a silver torrent. This isn't just a passing shower, is it? Eddie asked. Nope. It's going to rain until it gets tired of it, and then it's going to rain some more, just for spite. Maybe a week, maybe a month. Not that it's going to matter to us if Blaine decides he doesn't like our looks and fries us. Fire a shot to let Roland know we got here, sugar, and then we'll have us a look around, see what we can see. Eddie pointed the Ruger into the gray sky, pulled the trigger, and fired the shot which Roland heard a mile or more away. As he followed Jake and Gasher through the booby-trapped maze, Eddie stood where he was a moment longer, trying to persuade himself that things might still turn out all right, that his heart was wrong in its stubborn insistence that they had seen the last of the gunslinger and the boy Jake. Then he made the automatic safe again, returned it to the waistband of his pants, and went back to Susanna. He turned her chair away from the steps and rolled her along an aisle of columns which led deeper into the buildings. She popped the cylinder of Roland's gun and reloaded it as they went. Under the roof, the rain had a secret, ghostly sound, and even the harsh thunder cracks were muted. The columns which supported the structure were at least 10 feet in diameter, and their tops were lost in the gloom. From up there in the shadows, Eddie heard the cooing conversation of pigeons. Now a sign hanging on a thick chrome-silver chain swam out of the shadows. North Central Positronics welcomes you to the Cradle of Lud. Southeast travel, Blaine. Northwest travel, Patricia. Now we know the name of the one that fell in the river, Eddie said. Patricia. They got the colors wrong, though. It's supposed to be pink for girls and blue for boys, not the other way around. Maybe they're both pink. Or maybe they're both blue. They're not. Blaine's pink. How would you know that? Eddie looked confused. I don't know how, but I do. They followed the arrow pointing to Blaine's berth, entering what had to be a grand concourse. Eddie didn't have Susanna's ability to see the past in clear visionary flashes, but his imagination nonetheless filled this vast pillared space with 1,000 hurrying people. He heard clicking hills and murmuring voices, saw embraces of homecoming and farewell, and over everything, the speakers chanting news of 12 different destinations. Patricia is now boarding for Northwest Veronese. Will Passenger Killington, please report to the information booth on the lower level. Blaine is now arriving at berth 2 and will be debarking shortly. Now there was only pigeons. Eddie shivered. Look at the faces, Susanna murmured. I don't know if they give you the willies, but they sure do me. She pointed to the right. High up on the wall, a series of sculpted heads seemed to push out of the marble, peering down at them from the shadows, stern men with harsh faces of executioners who are happy in their work. Some of their faces had fallen from their places and lay in the granite shards and splinters 70 or 80 feet below their peers. Those remaining were spiderwebbed with cracks and splattered with pigeon dung. They must have been the Supreme Court or something, Eddie said, uneasily scanning all those thin lips and cracked, empty eyes. Only judges can look so smart and so contemptuously pissed off all the time. You're talking to a guy who knows. This isn't one of them. Who looks like he'd give you a crippled crab a crutch. A heap of broken images where the sun beats and the dead tree gives no shelter, Susanna murmured. And at these words Eddie felt gooseflesh walk across the skin of his arms and chest and legs. What's that, Suze? A poem by a man who must have seen Lud in his dreams, she said. Come on, Eddie, forget them. Easier said than done, but he began to push her again. Ahead, a vast grilled barrier like a castle barbican swam out of the gloom, and beyond it they caught their first glimpse of Blaine the mono. He was pink, just as Eddie had said it would be, a delicate shade which matched the veins running through the marble pillars. Blaine flowed above the wide loading platform in a smooth, streamlined bullet shape, which looked more like flesh than metal. Its surface was broken only once by a triangular window equipped with a huge wiper. Eddie knew there would be another triangular window with another big wiper on the other side of the mono's nose. So if you looked at Blaine head-on, it would seem to have a face. Just like Charlie the Choo-Choo, the wipers would look like slyly drooping eyelids. White lights from the southeastern slot in the cradle fell across Blaine in a long, distorted rectangle. To Eddie, the body of the train looked like the breaching back of some fabulous pink whale, one that was utterly silent. Wow. His voice had fallen to a whisper. We found it. Yes, Blaine the mono. Is it dead, do you think? It looks dead. It's not. Sleeping maybe, but a long way from dead. You sure? Were you sure it would be pink? It was a question he had to answer. It wasn't a question he had to answer, and he didn't. The face she turned up to him was strained and badly frightened. It's sleeping. And you know what? I'm scared to wake it up. Well, we'll wait for the others then. She shook her head. I think we'd better try to be ready for when they get here, because I've got an idea that they're going to come on the run. Push me over to that box mounted on the bars. It looks like an intercom. See it? He did, and pushed her slowly toward it. It was mounted on one side of a closed gate in the center of the barrier which ran the length of the cradle. The vertical bars of the barrier were made of what looked like stainless steel. Those of the gate appeared to be ornamental iron, and their lower ends disappeared into steel-ringed holes in the floor. There was no way either of them was going to wriggle through those bars either, Eddie saw. The gap between each set was no more than 4 inches. It would have been a tight squeeze, even for Oy. Pigeons ruffled and cooed overhead. The left wheel of Susanna's chair squawked monotonously. My kingdom for an oil can, Eddie thought, and then realized he was a lot more than just scared. This time, the last time he had felt this level of terror had been on the day when he and Henry had stood on the sidewalk of Reinhold Street and Dutch Hill, looking at the slumped ruin of the mansion. They hadn't gone in that day in 1977. They had turned their backs on the haunted house and walked away, and he remembered vowing to himself that he would never, never, ever go back to that place. It was a promise he'd kept. But here he was in another haunted house, and there was the haunter right over there, Blaine the mono, a long, low pink shape with one window peering at him like the eye of a dangerous animal who is shamming sleep. He stirs no more from his berth in the cradle. He has even stopped speaking in his many voices and laughing. Artist was the last to go nigh Blaine, and when Artist couldn't answer what was asked, Blaine slew him with blue fire. If it speaks to me, I'll probably go crazy, Eddie thought. The wind gusted outside, and a fine spray of rain flew in through the tall egress slot cut in the side of the building. He saw it strike Blaine's window and beat up there. Eddie shuddered suddenly and looked sharply around. We're being watched. I can feel it. I wouldn't be at all surprised. Push me closer to the gate, Eddie. I want to get a better look at that box. Okay, but don't touch it if it's electrified. If Blaine wants to cook us, he will, Susanna said, looking through the bars at Blaine's back. You know it, and I do too. And because Eddie knew that that was only the truth, he said nothing. The box looked like a combination intercom and burglar alarm. There was a speaker set into the top half, which looked like a talk-listen button next to it. Below this were numbers arranged in a shape which made a diamond. There you go. There's the diamond. And in the diamond, the numbers are 1 to 100, going all the way down. Under the diamond were 2 other buttons with words of the high speech printed on them, Command and Enter. Susanna looked bewildered and doubtful. What is this thing, do you think? It looks like a gadget in a science fiction movie. Of course it did, Eddie realized. Susanna had probably seen a home security system or two in her time. She had, after all, lived among the Manhattan rich, even if she had not been very enthusiastically accepted by them. But there was a world of difference between the electronic gear available in her when, 1963, and his own, which was 1987. We never talked much about the differences either, he thought. I wonder what she'd think if I told her Ronald Reagan was president of the United States when Roland snatched me. Probably that I was crazy. It's a security system, he said. Then, although his nerves and instincts screamed out against it, he forced himself to reach out with his right hand and thumb the talk-listen switch. There was no crackle of electricity, no deadly blue fire went racing up his arm, no sign that the thing was even still connected. Maybe Blaine is dead. Maybe he's dead after all, but he didn't really believe that. Hello, he said, and in his mind's eye he saw the unfortunate artist screaming as he was microwaved by the blue fire dancing all over his face and body, melting his eyes and setting his hair ablaze. Hello? Blaine? Anybody? He let go of the button and waited, stiff with tension. Susanna's hand crept into his, cold and small. There was still no answer, and Eddie, now more reluctant than ever, pushed the button again. Blaine? He let go of the button, waited, and when there was still no answer, a dangerous giddiness overcame him, as it often did in moments of stress and fear. When that giddiness took him, counting the cost no longer seemed to matter. Nothing mattered. It had been like that when he had outfaced Balazar's sallow-faced contact man in Nassau, and it was like that now. And if Roland had seen him in the moment this lunatic impatience overtook him, he would have seen more than just a resemblance between Eddie and Cuthbert. He would have sworn Eddie was Cuthbert. He jammed the button in with his thumb and began to bellow into the speaker, adopting a plummy and completely bogus British accent. "Hello, Blaine. Cheerio, old fellow. This is Robin Leach, host of Lifestyles of the Rich and Brainless, here to tell you what you have won $6 billion in a new Ford Escort in the Publishers Clearinghouse sweepstakes." Pigeons took flight above them in soft, startled explosion of wings. Susanna gasped. Her face wore the dismayed expression of a devout woman who has just heard her husband blaspheme in a cathedral. "Eddie, stop it! Stop it!" Eddie couldn't stop it. His mouth was smiling, but his eyes glittered with a mixture of fear, hysteria, and frustrated anger. "You and your monorail girlfriend Patricia will spend a luxurious month in the scenic Jimtown, where you'll drink only the finest wine and eat only the finest virgins. You—" "Shh!" Eddie broke off, looking at Susanna. He was at once sure that it had been she who had shushed him, not only because she had already tried, but because she was the only other person here, and yet at the same time, he knew it hadn't been Susanna. That had been another voice, the voice of a very young, very frightened child. "Suze, did you—" Susanna was shaking her head and raising her hand at the same time. She pointed at the intercom box, and Eddie saw the button marked "Command" was glowing in a very faint shell pink. It was the same color as the mono sleeping in its berth on the other side of the barrier. "Shh! Don't wake him up," the child's voice mourned. It drifted from the speaker, soft as an evening breeze. "What?" Eddie began. Then he shook his head, reached toward the talk listen switch, and pressed it gently. When he spoke again, it was not in the blaring Robin Leach bellow, but in the almost whisper of a conspirator. "What are you? Who are you?" He released the button. He and Susanna regarded each other with big eyes of children who now know they are sharing the house with a dangerous, perhaps psychotic, adult. How have they come by the knowledge? Why, just because another child has told them, a child who has lived with the psychotic adult for a long time, hiding in the corners, stealing out only when it knows the adult is asleep. A frightened child who happens to be almost invisible. There was no answer. Eddie let the seconds spin out. Each one seemed long enough to read a whole novel in. He was reaching for the button again when the faint pink glow reappeared. "I'm little Blaine," the child's voice whispered. "The one he doesn't see. The one he forgot. The one he thinks he left behind in the rooms of the ruin and the halls of the dead." Eddie pushed the button again with a hand that picked up an uncomfortable shake. He could hear that shake in his voice as well. "Who? Who is the one who doesn't see? Is that the bear?" "No, not the bear. Not he. Shardik lay dead in the forest many miles behind them." The world had moved on even since then. Eddie suddenly remembered what it had been like to lay his ear against the strange, unfolded door in the clearing where the bear had lived its violent half-life. That door with its somehow terrible stripes of yellow and black. It was all of a piece, he realized now. All part of some awful decaying whole, a tattered web with the dark tower at its center, like an incomprehensible stone spider. All of Midworld had become one vast, haunted mansion in these strange latter days. All of Midworld had become the drawers. All of Midworld had become a wasteland, haunting and haunted. He saw Susanna's lips form the words of the real answer before the voice from the intercom could speak them, and those words were as obvious as the solution to a riddle once the answer is spoken. "Big Blaine," the unseen voice whispered. "Big Blaine is the ghost in the machine. The ghost in all the machines." Susanna's hand had gone to her throat and was clutching it as if she intended to strangle herself. Her eyes were full of terror, but they were not glassy, not stunned. They were sharp with understanding. Perhaps she knew a voice like this from her own Win. And where the integrated whole that was Susanna had been shunted aside by the warring personalities of Detta and Odetta. The childish voice surprised her as well as him, but her agonized eyes said she was no stranger to the concept being expressed. Susanna knew all about the madness of duality. "Eddie, we have to go," she said. Her terror turned the words into an unpunctuated auditory smear. He could hear air whistling in her windpipe like a cold wind around a chimney. "Eddie, we have to get away. Eddie, we have to get away. Eddie." "Too late," the tiny, mourning voice said. "He's awake. Big Blaine is awake. He knows you are here, and he's coming." Suddenly, lights, bright orange arc sodiums, began to flash on in pairs above them, bathing the pillared vastness of the cradle in the harsh glare that banished all shadows. Hundreds of pigeons darted and swooped in frightened, aimless flight, startling from the complex of interlocked nests high above. "Wait!" Eddie shouted. "Please wait!" In his agitation he forgot to push the button, but it made no difference. Little Blaine responded anyway. "No! I can't let him catch me. I can't let him kill me too." The light on the intercom box went dark again, but only for a moment. This time both command and enter lit up, and the color was not pink, but the lurid dark red of a blacksmith's forge. "Who are you?" a voice roared, and it came not just from the box, but from every speaker in the city which still operated. The rotting bodies hanging from the poles shivered with the vibrations of that mighty voice. It seemed that even the dead would run from Blaine if they could. Susanna shrank back in her chair, the heels of her hands pressed to her ears, her face long with dismay, her mouth distorted in silent screams. Eddie felt himself shrinking toward all the fantastic, hallucinatory terrors of 11. Had it been this voice he had feared when he and Henry stood outside the mansion? That he had perhaps even anticipated? He didn't know. But he did know how Jack in that old story must have felt when he realized that he had tried the beanstalk once too often and awakened the giant. "How dare you disturb my sleep? Tell me now or die where you stand." He might have frozen right there, leaving Big Blaine, to do to them whatever it was he had done to Artis, or something even worse. Perhaps should have frozen, locked in that down the rabbit hole fairy tale terror. It was the memory of the small voice which had spoken first that enabled him to move. It had been the voice of a terrified child, but it had tried to help them, terrified or not. "So now you have to help yourself," he thought. "You woke it up. Deal with it, for Christ's sake." Eddie reached out and pushed the button again. "My name is Eddie Dean. The woman with me is my wife, Susanna. We're—" He looked at Susanna, who nodded and made frantic motions for him to go on. "We're on a quest. We seek the dark tower which lies in the path of the beam. We're in the company of 2 others, Roland of Gilead and Jake of New York. We're from New York, too, if you're—" He paused for a moment, biting back the words Big Blaine. If he used them, he might make the intelligence behind the voice aware that they had heard another voice, a ghost inside the ghost, so to speak. Susanna gestured again for him to go on, using both hands. "If you're Blaine the Mono, well, we want you to take us." He released the button. There was no response for what seemed like a very long time, only the agitated flutter of the disturbed pigeons from overhead. When Blaine spoke again, the voice came only from the speaker box mounted on the gate and sounded almost human. "Do not try my patience. All the doors to that where are closed. Gilead is no more, and those known as gunslingers are all dead. Now answer my question. Who are you? This is your last chance." There was a sizzling sound. A ray of brilliant blue-white light lanced down from the ceiling and seared a hole the size of a golf ball in the marble floor less than 5 feet to the left of Susanna's wheelchair. Smoke that smelted like the aftermath of lightning bolt rose lazily from it. Susanna and Eddie stared at each other in mute terror for a moment, and then Eddie lunged for the communicator box and thumbed the button. "You're wrong. We did come from New York. We came through the doors on the beach only a few weeks ago." "It's true," Susanna called. "I swear it is." Silence. Beyond the long barrier, Blaine's pink back humped smoothly. The window at the front seemed to regard them like a vapid glass eye. The wiper could have been a lid half closed in a sly wink. "Prove it," Blaine said at last. "Christ, how do I do that?" Eddie asked Susanna. "I don't know." Eddie pushed the button again. "The Statue of Liberty. Does that ring a bell?" "Go on," Blaine said. Now the voice sounded almost thoughtful. "The Empire State Building, the Stock Exchange, the World Trade Center, Coney Island Red Hots, Radio City Music Hall, the Eastville—" "Okay, Pilgrim, I believe you." Eddie and Susanna shared another glance, this one of confusion and relief, but when Blaine spoke again, the voice was again cold and emotionless. "Ask me a question, Eddie Dean of New York, and it better be a good one." There was a pause, and then Blaine added, "Because if it's not, you and your woman are going to die, no matter where you came from." Susanna looked from the box on the gate to Eddie. "What's it talking about?" she hissed. Eddie shook his head. "I don't have the slightest idea." All right, pretty shiny peoples, thank you for coming to today's reading, and we're going to go ahead and stop there because I got a message saying that the people will be here for repairs soon enough. And then it's going to get loud. So unfortunately, we might have to do 2 more readings instead of 1. However, look, see that? That's all we have left. Once we finish that little piece right here, we will be on to the next book. So, as always, thank you for your patience and your kindness, and we will see you next week. And maybe next week I'll be closer to telling you a little more about the special project for the book club. And maybe I will stream here in a little bit while I continue to get ready for this function this evening. Don't forget to smile, have bunches of fun, all that good stuff, and later days, pretty shiny peoples.